listeners, welcome to another video. I'm so glad to have you here. For friends who need it, I'm a white young person with light brown, shoulder length, curly hair. I am wearing a white t-shirt with a blue and white striped jumpsuit on top of it that you can't actually see. You can just see the straps of it. And I'm sitting in front of a plain wall that has green leaves on it. And today we're going to talk about what actually happened with the Stanford Prison Experiment and what we can learn from it. Because boy, do I like a quick genre shift of videos. I really just bring down a little whiplash every week. This is not going to be the gory details of all the horrors of it kind of thing. I'm going to keep that information as minimal as humanly possible. I think there's way more interesting things about it, like the research ethics of it and the power of storytelling and popular science that we can learn from this that are way more important than any sort of true crimification of the story. Frankly, I didn't learn much about the horrors of it because I didn't want to know. That was upsetting. That's not what really matters about this narrative, in my opinion. So if you do want the gory details, you can find them on the Stanford Prison Experiment Wikipedia page. I'm also quite sure that there's like documentaries about it on YouTube. But there is a film version that is just factually incorrect as to what took place, so maybe don't watch that. But you're not going to find that here. Either way, quick content warning for mentions of abuse and torture in this video, but I'm going to keep it as minimal as humanly possible. So, the Stanford Prison Experiment was a psychological experiment. But let's be real with ourselves, this is as much of a psychological experiment as like Love is Blind is a psychological experiment that took place in August of 1971 in the basement of a Stanford University building. It was run by a psychology professor by the name of Philip Zimbardo, who looks precisely like what you expect him to look like when you Google this man. Also, the ethics of this experiment were approved by the Stanford Psych Department and the wider University Committee of Human Experimentation. How? I don't know. And it was funded by the U.S. Office of Naval Research because they wanted to know more about the cause of conflict between military guards and prisoners, apparently. But also other sources I've read said they already had significant research on it that this would not have added to at all whatsoever. So I'm really questionable about that. The overall goal of the experiment, according to their website, was that they wanted to see what the psychological effects were of becoming a prisoner or prison guard. To do this, we decided to set up a simulated prison and then carefully note the effects of this institution on the behavior of all those within its walls, with a focus on studying roles, rules, symbols, groupthink, dehumanization, and de-individualism. So that's the basic elevator pitch for you. Let's talk about how the experiment itself went. And then the rest of what came afterwards, because a lot came afterwards. Zimbardo recruited participants via an ad in the local newspaper that read, "Male college students needed for psychological study of prison life, $15 per day for 1 to 2 weeks, beginning August 14th. For further information and applications, come to room 248, Jordan Hall, Stanford U." $15 a day in 1971 is about $115 in today's money. They had 75 men apply and ended up choosing 24 after assessing them for psychological stability and excluding people with criminal backgrounds, psychological impairments, and otherwise medical problems. Which isn't, because one dude was on medication for eczema that they wouldn't let him use, so I don't know how that happened. Let's just say they weren't very thorough, which is a thing that I think is going to continue to come up as we go through this. Most of these men were white and middle class, and they would be assigned to prisoner versus guard, supposedly via coin toss, and then they ended up with 10 prisoners and 11 guards because one dropped out and they had 2 reserves if need be. The study was set up in a 35-foot section of the basement of Jordan Hall. Everything I read just said 35 foot. I don't know if they meant square foot or if that was the length of the hall and the width was something else. I'm really confused as to what precisely they meant by that statistic, but the main point, it was small. It was a tiny section of the basement of a college building, and they created 3 mock cells. Each one was to hold 3 prisoners, which each had cots with a mattress, sheet, and pillow. The small corridor was their prison yard, and there was a closet for solitary, and then a bigger room for the guards to hang out in, as well as the warden, with Zimbardo as the superintendent of the prison, and his undergrad research assistant by the name of David Jaffe as the warden. I don't know if that's how Jaffe's last name is pronounced, but that's how we're going to pronounce it for this video. And also, yes, I don't know what happened with the extra prisoner or where he went because there are 3 prisoners per cell, and then they said there's 10 prisoners. I have a lot of hyper-specific logistical questions that came up for me in researching this, and nothing anywhere on the internet had any clear answers for me, which is really a tragedy. So the not adding up of information here is not because I researched poorly, it's because I read like 20 different sources that all said the same thing, and it didn't make sense for many of them. But anywho, during this experiment, the prisoners had to stay there 24/7, they were prisoners, and then the guards worked 8-hour shifts with 3 guards on each shift, and everybody else was on call when they weren't there, but they could go home and like be a person between shifts. They also had access to special areas in the prison for rest and relaxation where they could go and hang out when they were you know, on their off time and whatever. The day before the start of the experiment, the guards were brought in for an orientation with Jaffe and Zimbardo. At orientation, they were given their uniforms, they were given mirrored aviator sunglasses to prevent eye contact and keep anonymity, a whistle, and a wooden baton. I don't love that they were given actual weapons without any training on how to use them, because yes, they were instructed to not injure any of the participants, but I still, those are weapons. They're being given, potentially could be used for lethal purposes, weapons, and telling them to be in control of people. And I'm not a fan of that. And then they were given instructions on how the experiment was going to run. They were told to keep the prisoners in order and to refer to them by their numbers rather than their names. And we're gonna come back to this orientation situation later. The next day, the actual Palo Alto police went to find the fake prisoners and genuinely arrested them without any prior knowledge for armed robbery and burglary, and brought them to the station to fingerprint and photograph them, and then they were brought to the basement prison where they were strip searched and deloused and given their uniform, which is effectively a hospital gown smock situation with their numbers sewn onto it, no underwear, a nylon stocking cap, and a heavy chain around one ankle. Also no, the arresting was not in the participant agreement that they signed, so arresting them in that manner was already a breach of ethics. It's also against the Constitution. They arrested them without probable cause. On the second day, the prisoners staged a rebellion mid-morning, and the guards responded by spraying them with fire extinguishers, and then they called in backup, and then the prisoners lost their mattresses, and some of them were put into solitary, and the prisoners who were less involved were then rewarded with special food. They got their beds back, etc., all that stuff. Also, throughout the experiment, the guards rewarded random prisoners for no visible reason, which made people think that like people were tattling, so they would start to turn on each other and whatnot. On the third day, a prisoner by the name of Douglas Corby had what seemed to be a mental breakdown of sorts, so he was released from the experiment. He has since said that he faked this mental breakdown so he could leave because he just really wanted to study for his GREs and he was having a difficult time being imprisoned, and wishes that he had filed false imprisonment charges at the time. Zimbardo has pointed out that Corby's story on the situation has changed a lot over the years, as for a while he said very publicly that being imprisoned was one of the most difficult things he'd ever been through, and his claims of faking are more recent, so it's not that reliable. But in a 1971 tape directly after the experiment, Corby does directly say he faked the breakdown, so I would vote that he did. Also, I'm not including the information in regards to various abuse done on the prisoners throughout this in like day by day breakdown, because I don't know when specific things happened, but some things involved were forcing them to do push-ups, sometimes with like their feet on the backs of the prisoners doing the push-ups, having a bathroom cutoff time, so if they had to go to the bathroom between certain hours, they'd have to go into a bucket in their cell that they weren't allowed to empty, waking them up at odd hours at night to sleep deprive them, humiliating them in various ways, etc., etc. They were also denied sunlight and fresh air and not able to do any like constructive activities during their time there, which is not how prison works. And at the start they were denied their glasses if they wore them, but then apparently got those back later, unclear. And also they were denied cigarettes with the exception of the rewarded prisoners, if I understand correctly. And this is a time when people smoked a lot, so a lot of people were definitely also going through nicotine withdrawals. That's a thing I've never really seen mentioned before. But one prisoner went on hunger strike. He was put in solitary. Several of them had breakdowns and were repeatedly asked to be released. And by the end of the experiment, half of the prisoners had been released early. Also, one guy got a huge rash all over his body and had to be released early. And it's been described as like this dramatic psychosomatic response to captivity, and it's a whole thing. But they were just denying him his eczema medication. And so that's why that happened. On the fourth day, the prisoners started to distance themselves from each other because they were worried about snitches. Also, another prisoner was released, and a chaplain came in to be their prison chaplain and met with each prisoner individually, and he told them, for some reason, that they would only be able to get out of this prison if they had a lawyer, which obviously caused a lot of concern from the prisoners. On the fifth day, Zimbardo decided to schedule visitation. I don't know why he decided to add so many things to this experiment, and also so early in the experiment, but sure, whatever. I have a lot of questions as to Zimbardo's logic on a whole lot of things. This is just the tip of the iceberg. Now, some of the parents who visited were very concerned about their children, reasonably so, and said that they planned to contact lawyers to get them released. And also a colleague of Zimbardo's came and said, like, dude, what is your independent variable? What are you doing here? And also Zimbardo's girlfriend at the time, who later became his wife, Christina Maslach, also visited and supposedly told him that the experiment was deeply immoral and he had changed as a person since the start of the experiment and he got too sucked into his role or whatever. So the next day he ended the experiment early. And then there were lots of meetings and debriefings and retrospectives and whatnot for all the participants, starting immediately after and lasting for a good while after. So they had lots of records of what took place. And the famous results to come out of this experiment were that the behavior of these people, the passiveness of the prisoners, and the ruthlessness of the guards was caused by this situation, not the type of person going into it, because there were a bunch of normal people that went into this study and came out, you know, being truly in their roles as prisoners and as guards. And that was then used to state that, like, people slip naturally into their social roles when they're, like, in powerful situations. I feel like that sentence was a direct quote from something, and I don't know where, so if that sounded plagiarized, that's sorry. Anyway, the thing about these results is that they are very general, and they were more or less based on subjective and anecdotal information from the study. Like, oh, our guards made these prisoners do push-ups. The guards at Auschwitz made their prisoners do push-ups, so these two things are comparable, which... no. Also Zimbardo very much generalized it to much wider things like, oh, if this is how people behave in the institution of prison, this has wide implications about how people behave in other institutions, such as in colleges or in marriage. Which is also an extrapolation for sure. We're going to talk more about the results shortly. It's also important to note that he did not publish these results until 1973, 2 years after the experiment took place, but the story of the results of the experiment was in the public eye immediately after the experiment, if not actively during it. Zimbardo invited TV reporters to film the arrests. He sent out a press release on the second day of the study implying that the results of his study would have crucial implications in regards to prison reform, and then the day after the end of the study, there was a prisoner uprising at San Quentin, followed by another one 3 weeks later in Attica, New York, and Zimbardo was called to answer questions about these uprisings in regards to his recent research on prisons that he had not actually gone through all the data for yet. It also obviously had not been peer-reviewed, but that was not standard until the 80s or 90s, so I'm not going to blame him for that. And in November, 3 months after the study, there was a 20-minute primetime TV special exclusively about the experiment, again, 2 years before he had published the paper with all of his actual organized data in it. Which brings us into why this study got so popular. The first reason is that obviously Zimbardo wanted it to be popular. He worked hard to make sure that it would be popular and people would know about it and people would know his name, which could have been like, oh, I really want to change prisons to be less harmful and this could help, so I need it to become popular so I can make that a reality. It could have been straight hubris. It could have been a combination of the two. Probably a combination of the two. The second reason is that this experiment is really sexy. It's really interesting, even for an era that I refer to as the Wild West of psychological experimentation. There's a lot going on. There's a lot you want to know about. It also became very quickly relevant with the prison uprisings and therefore somewhat cemented the authority of psychology. Like, we did this experiment so we understand why humans behave this particular way, so maybe in the future we can stop these horrible things or otherwise do something about it. So people, you know, like this study because it's like, oh yeah, psychology research is important. And so it's kind of cemented for that reason. There's a reason this is one of the foundational studies we hear about in all of our intropsych textbooks. This was also an era when two major things were happening in psychology. The first is the argument as to whether people do what they do because of intrinsic personality or because of the situation around them, which, much like nature nurture, is a pointless thing to argue because it's obviously a combination of the two. And then the second thing is the Holocaust. People were really trying to grapple with the Holocaust and figure out why that happened and why people behaved the way that they did, which led to some really weird and ethically dubious psychological experiments. In regards to the first part of psychology, this experiment was a powerful tool in the argument that humans are more situational than based on individual personal free will. It is still a huge part of the legacy of that school of thought. In regards to the Holocaust portion, the Stanford Prison Experiment expanded upon the ideas of the other most famous psychological experiment of all time, the Milgram Experiment. I might make a video at some point to expand on the Milgram Experiment. Let me know if you'll be interested in that. It's also been debunked in a very similar way to this experiment. But basically, this is the experiment at Yale in the 60s where they brought in people and told them that they were going to help with a study to see if people learned better when given electric shocks, and the participants were instructed to administer the shocks themselves, going up to dangerous levels of shock. There was no actual shock taking place. The whole setup was fake, but the idea was to see if people will do terrible things because they thought they were helping for the betterment of humanity, and if they will like respond to authority in that way. And the results that came out of that was like, yes, many people did very much go along with authority and do the wrong thing, which is now very disputed on several levels. But basically, the idea that came out of that experiment is that people will do horrible things if given orders to do horrible things. And Zimbardo expanded upon that to show that people will do horrible things even if not given orders. All it takes is that they're put put in a situation. Other big cultural touchstones in this era were the construction of the psychopath, also not a thing that exists, the golden age of serial killers, the like people are inherently evil, and the concept of the banality of evil. And if you're unfamiliar with the concept of the banality of evil, it's basically the idea that most evil is not like scary person walking around being spooky villain, but rather that it's somebody simply behind a desk who is fulfilling orders, and it's just a normal regular day for them. The concept of it was coined by Hannah Arendt in her 1963 book Eichmann and Jerusalem, a report on the banality of evil about Eichmann's trial as one of the main orchestrators of the Holocaust. But I think it's important to note is that him saying that he was just following orders is his legal defense and his testimony, not necessarily, most probably not his actual reality. So yes, the banality of evil is somewhat a concept in that we can do evil in small things that we do, but it's not as widespread and lurking and scary as the wider use of the concept has made it seem. We're not going to accidentally, whoops, I did a Holocaust. Like, that's not how that works. He was aware of what he did. That was not like a, oops, I was just following orders kind of situation. And also the biggest things that are most rarely discussed in experiments that supposedly showed the banality of evil, like Milgram and Stanford, are that the vast majority of participants did not do the wrong thing and instead stood up to authority and refused until aggressively coerced into doing what the experimenters wanted them to do. Either way, since then, Zimbardo has been used as a witness in congressional testimony about the Abu Ghraib prison torture that came out in March of 2004 and was often consulted in regards to prison issues, and is often currently consulted in regards to prison issues. His experiment also did change some prison reform in that in the United States now kids are no longer housed pre-trial with adults due to risk of violence against them. And also this experiment was 100% a part of the creation of institutional review boards for human research. Like, IRBs were and primarily a response to the Tuskegee syphilis study, but the ethics of the Stanford prison experiment have been hotly debated since the moment it took place, and given how high profile it was definitely taken into consideration when creating the ethical rules that we have today. So let's talk about ethics. The first piece is informed consent. The participants did sign a sort of agreement for doing the study, but it did not explain the extent of what they would be experiencing in this study, simply because Zimbardo didn't know where the experiment was going to go. He kind of did. We'll get to that later. And the prisoners in particular were not actually able to give full informed consent because of this, which was also immediately violated with their surprise arrests, which again, fully unconstitutional, and I don't know why the police department just agreed to do that. They also subjected participants to psychological warfare and humiliation, some of which, I'm thinking of sleep deprivation in particular, is bordering on against the Geneva Convention. There were sanitary concerns with the bathroom buckets. The experiment was also continued even when participants repeatedly asked to quit and they were not allowed to leave. One thing that comes up a lot in Zimbardo's research is about how powerful it is that, oh, so many of these men had mental breakdowns, like, oh, learned helplessness like sets in so quickly. But that's because they learned from the first guy. That was the only way for them to get out of there. And even that didn't work because they had mental breakdowns and they weren't allowed to leave, at which point they were no longer pretending to be prisoners in a study. They were actually being held against their will. Zimbardo himself acknowledges more recently that it was deeply unethical, and often when people critique the study and its full lack of replicability, he's like, well, my study was correct. It's just not replicable because it wasn't ethical, so you can't actually replicate it properly, which I don't think is the strong vote of like confidence that he thinks it is, but sure, buddy, whatever. But either way, he did say this in April of 2011. There's no question that it was a high level of stress because 5 of the boys had emotional breakdowns, the first within 36 hours. And so it is no question that it was unethical. You can't do research where you allow people to suffer at that level. Fantastic. Now in 2018, a French scholar by the name of Thibault Le Texier published a book titled History of a Lie, an inquiry into the Stanford prison experiment, which then in August of 2019 had an academic article, either piece of or summary of the book published in English by the American Psychological Association titled Debunking the Stanford Prison Experiment. Le Texier was somehow the first researcher ever to sit down and go through all of the archived documents, footage, and audio from the experiment, and he also did follow-up interviews with many of the people involved and systematically broke down every single piece of the experiment in his paper, and also his book. I'm assuming. That's in French. I didn't read it. Zimbardo has tried to dismiss Le Texier's work by repeatedly saying, oh, it's primarily ad hominem attacks, but that's not that's not how it's written. So let's go through this together, shall we? Also, shout out to a podcast I listened to called You're Wrong About that had an episode dedicated to the Stanford Prison Experiment that was just incredibly put together and really nicely paired with and expanded upon Letexier's research, and I really enjoyed it, so you should go check them out. Now, the first critique of the study is that many discussions of the experiment talk about how people got so involved in it that they lost touch with reality, and Zimbardo himself repeatedly, regularly claims that they all, including himself, just like got caught up in it and carried away. But the archive materials show that they were all pretty aware they were an experiment for the entire time. Nobody was in actual prison uniforms. Also, prisoners get to wear underwear. They could hear the sounds of the copier and people in other offices the entire time, and the only one to confide that they occasionally forgot sometimes was one of the guards. Letexier theorizes that based on the archive, rather than the dramatic, like, girlfriend sees experiment and has big fight with Zimbardo saying he's changed because of it and that snapped him out of it, it was more that Zimbardo hadn't, like, slept in a few days and had been doing a whole lot of work and had already gotten the results that he wanted, and he wanted the experiment to be over, and that's why he ended it. It was also starting to look really bad and raise red flags, so him acting like he was like, oh, I got caught up in a higher power, and that makes him look a whole lot better at the end of all of it. And this guy knows how to do press and public relations. Like, this, he knows what he is doing. And also, not only was it unrealistic in the sense that they all knew it wasn't real the whole time, but it also just isn't how prisons are run. So the results cannot be extrapolated more widely because it wasn't actually a prison experiment. As Letexier says in his paper, at the time of the SPE, as Zimbardo admitted, I knew really nothing about prisons. He imagined the SPE almost entirely on the basis of the testimonies of the ex-convict Carlo Prescott and of the Toyin Hall experiment. His articles and The Lucifer Effect quote only two books on detention, The Prison Letters of George Jackson and the novelized testimony of a French former inmate. The archives reveal no other written sources. We will talk about Carlo Prescott and the Toyin Hall experiment shortly, stand by on that, but none of his work quotes any other writings or data about prisons anywhere, and many critics of the study talk about how prisons are structured so differently that there is no universe in which this would relate to them. His prison was closer to the structure of a concentration camp or a haphazardly constructed prisoner of war camp than it was an actual prison, because prisons already have systems and structures and social hierarchies at play. It's not like all guards and all prisoners just like appear and have their first day together at the same time. They also didn't have any access to recreation or rehabilitation here, which is unrealistic, and a huge factor in the prison industrial complex, or generally prisons or concentration camps around the world, is there is almost always some semblance of racial and gender politics at play. And also disability. Like, the vast majority of incarcerated people are disabled, and incarceration is an inherently disabling event, but that's a whole other conversation that we're not going to get into right now. But in making all but one of the participants white men, the other one was an Asian American man, in an effort to eliminate the variable of race and gender, you miss a huge portion of what actual power dynamics in prisoner life look like. And specifically, a lot of critiques have been like, you could have just studied the actual Holocaust or real prisons or actual prisoner of war camps. Why did you create this? What was the purpose of creating this? Which then brings in the question of, like, why do we consistently hold science as more important and more credible than history, especially when, in this case, it's bad science? Like, that one professor literally asked Zimbardo what his independent variable was. There was no actual study going on here. Also, for the record, Zimbardo now says it's a demonstration and not a study, but we're far past that. We've moved, it's too far gone. There's nothing we can do about it now. There was no control group, there was no variable, there was no plan other than just like muck around and find out. They also didn't collect any personal information like cultural backgrounds, religion, social status, even like what these guys were majoring in college. Like, none of that information was collected, which might have impacted how they responded to the environment of their prison. I would love to know if the Asian American man was treated differently in this prison than the rest of the white guys. I don't know. And the other big red flag is bias, particularly on Zimbardo's part, because before the study he had very strong opinions on the ethics of prisons and was very anti-corrections, which, me too, and you can have opinions on things before you research them, but it was very clear that he had constructed the study with the purpose of saying, hey, prisons are bad for prisoners, which we can tell by how he publicized the study while it was taking place and what he said directly after the fact. The press release that Zimbardo disseminated on the second day of the experiment states in conclusion that it aimed at making us aware of the prison reforms needed at a psychological level in order that men who commit crimes are not made into dehumanized objects by their prison experience and in turn prey upon society when they are released, worse criminals than when they went in. Also, out of 150 hours of the study, only 6 were recorded on video and 48 audio recorded. He has specifically stated that filming was expensive, so they only turned on cameras when particularly interesting things were happening. We know that only about a third of the guards were behaving harshly toward prisoners, and yet Zimbardo talks about how generally all the guards behaved this way or that way with various severity. And also, speaking of Zimbardo and bias, You're Wrong About brought up another study of his where he put an abandoned car with the hood up in 2 different places, somewhere in the Bronx and somewhere in Palo Alto, and states that in the Bronx, the car was picked for parts and destroyed almost immediately, exclusively by well-dressed white people, and then the Palo Alto car was left untouched until Zimbardo went and smashed a piece of it, and then suddenly tons of other well-dressed white people were willing to destroy this car. And the idea of the study is that large cities de-individualize good people and therefore make them more likely to do horrible things such as commit crimes because they're less likely to be held accountable for them. The authors of the broken windows theory, which basically states that visible signs of crime or criminal behavior create an environment that encourages further crime, took his study with the cars as part of the evidence for their own point. The broken windows theory has little to no evidence supporting that it actually exists. But yeah, fun story. So the well-dressed white men that destroyed the Palo Alto car were his graduate students that came out to join him in destroying it when they saw him do it, which seems like an important piece of data that very much affects the potential outcome of the study, that maybe should have been included in the study. Anyway, he also later talks about the study and then comes up with a completely different conclusion than in the original one that he published, and acts like those two conclusions are the same thing. And then in writing about it, I believe this is in his book The Lucifer Effect, he starts the chapter with the myth of Kitty Genovese, a woman who was murdered in a courtyard of her apartment building where there were supposedly 38 witnesses and nobody called the police, which is regularly used as evidence of the bystander effect. But that's also not what happened in regards to Kitty's death, which we've known for a long time that was just an error in reporting, and he acknowledges that. He says there are significant doubts as to the truth of that initial New York Times report about it, and then follows that up with, nevertheless, this says a lot about human behavior. Like, he gave an example. He said, well, it's probably not real. And then he was like, but let's ignore that it's not real because it's interesting, which I think really encapsulates a lot of how he seemed to look at data and science in general, like with a primary focus on the story that can be told for what he sees as the good of helping people, rather than the truth of the story itself, if that makes sense. But let's go back to the Twain Hall experiment that was mentioned earlier. So if you remember David Jaffe, who we talked about, the warden and research assistant to Zimbardo, he was in one of Zimbardo's classes the spring semester directly before the Stanford Prison experiment, and he and a group of 4 other students did a project for his class where they turned a part of a dorm into a tiny prison with 6 guards and 6 prisoners, and Jaffe as director. The study ran from May 15th to May 16th, and beforehand, Jaffe visited a county jail and also befriended an ex-convict by the name of Carlo Prescott before running this study. In his version, they found that at first the prisoners tried to assert individuality against the guards, but then later somewhat gave in and started to obey the guards, with the exception of one girl who fought the entire time, and I support her. Now, after presenting their results in class, Zimbardo was really interested. He wanted to learn more about it. He was introduced to Carlo Prescott, who then became a consultant on the Stanford Prison experiment, and Jaffe became the research assistant. Now, I don't know how common it is for undergrad projects to become full research projects primarily run by their advisors. I would assume it's semi-common, but using almost the exact same structure unchanged and then publishing that new research without ever mentioning the previous trials of said experiment, which is important data when it comes to research transparency, is deeply concerning and also irresponsible. Zimbardo has given credit to the former experiment only twice. The other major thing is the presence of a thing called demand characteristics, which basically mean that participants who are aware that they are in a study are more likely to behave in ways that they think the researchers want them to behave, which is a thing that Zimbardo was well aware of because he quoted a paper on demand characteristics in one of his writings prior to this experiment. Many participants have since, and also like directly after and during the debriefing, said that they were acting. They felt like they had to do what the researchers wanted them to do so that they could get paid, so that the results of the research would come out right, whatever, which means that many of them behaved the way they thought their specific character might behave. The most violent of the guards also specifically said that he had studied acting and he was consciously creating this persona. Like, they were all deliberately playing characters. They were not actively, naturally responding to the experiment around them. There is a point to be made that if you behaved in a way you were embarrassed by in one of the most famous studies of all time, you would probably say that you were faking it after the fact. But given that many of them reported that they were well aware it was an experiment the entire time and were not actually lost in it at any point, the fact that they were acting is very, very likely. They also didn't know that they were allowed to leave. A huge part of informed consent now is that you can quit or leave at any time with no penalty. Obviously, that is really complicated emotionally in actual reality, but in technicality, that option should always be there. The protocol he submitted to Stanford's ethics committee on July 31st, 1971 stated that prisoners would be led to believe that they cannot leave except for emergency reasons. Medical staff will be available to assess any request to terminate participation. Prison subjects will be discouraged from quitting. Which would again explain all of the so-called mental breakdowns, and another reason that they wanted to comply and do what they thought they were supposed to do so that they could get to the end and get paid for their time. But most damningly and most importantly, which is why I left this to the end, Zimbardo and Jaffe also literally told the guards what to do. During orientation, Zimbardo explained that the goal of the experiment was to study the conditions which lead to mob behavior, violence, loss of identity, feelings of anonymity. Essentially, we're setting up a physical prison here to study what that does, and those are some of the variables that we've discovered are current in prisons. Those are some of the psychological barriers, and we want to recreate in our prison that psychological environment. And he positioned the guards as fellow researchers who needed to be tough to help achieve the important goal of changing the prison industrial system. He says, "We're not trying to do this just because we're sadists," and then supplies a rationale for harming the prisoners. "If you need an excuse, and I think most of us do really, it is so we can learn what happens in a total institution, and we want to know about them, so that we can get on the media and into the press with it." Jaffe also seems to have given the guards specific recommendations based on his experience doing the Toyne Hall experiment a few months prior. There's also audio between Jaffe and one of the guards who didn't really want to be involved on the first day, telling the guard that he needed to be tougher and try harder in order to get what is necessary out of the experiment. In 2018, researcher Jared Bartels presented a group of people with the orientation given to the guards of the Stanford Prison Experiment and a control group to a standard orientation, and he found that across 3 studies, participants exposed to the Stanford orientation relative to a control orientation reported greater expectations for hostile and oppressive behavior on the part of the study's investigator and from others and themselves as guards. So you can't do that. That's called interfering with and fudging data. And speaking of data, there have been some attempts to replicate the study as well. So in 1979, Australian researchers ran a slightly more ethical version of this study, and they ran it 3 different times with different structures each time. So the first that was most similar to the Stanford Prison Experiment, that one turned out with nearly identical results, while the other 2 had more participatory structures and ended up not having these power dynamics, implying that humans are capable of being in charge of other humans without being inherently sadistic and evil. The BBC Prison study was in 2002 but published in 2006. This one was also filmed as a reality TV show. The purpose of it was to point out limitations in Zimbardo's study, to which Zimbardo was like, "It's reality TV, so they're not reacting normally, so actually it doesn't count." When didn't you have the press involved in your own study? Is that not? Anyway, this version had an ethics committee, and the ethics committee was there. And it was advertised solely as a university-backed social experiment that would be shown on TV, and guards were not instructed on their behavior at all whatsoever. They had to sort it out for themselves. In this study, they found no evidence of guards conforming naturally to their roles as guards, and in fact, on day 6, there was a full prison breakout, followed by the creation of a self-governing commune that then collapsed due to infighting, and then a group of participants made up of both prisoners and guards conspired to create a new regime, and the new regime looked like the Stanford Prison Experiment, so that's when they ended it for ethical reasons. In 2005, an op-ed was published in the Stanford Daily by Carlo Prescott, stating that many of the horrors documented from the guards' behavior in the Stanford Prison Experiment were in fact things that had happened to him when he was imprisoned at San Quentin, that he had shared with the research team months before the study, and there was literally no way the guards could have come up with that on their own, which casts further doubt as to the legitimacy of the original study. Zimbardo does claim that Prescott doesn't write like that, and he thinks that it was authored by a screenwriter guy who was mad that he didn't get the film rights to the Stanford Prison Experiment story. But either way, Prescott has said in several interviews with journalists about the fact that some of the guards' behaviors were his ideas. There's also doubt as to the actual normality of the participants of this study. Whoever signed up for it originally had to be a male college student who was at least somewhat interested in, or at minimum not offended by prisons, had to be free during the summer, and were intrigued by $100 a day. So is that therefore an actual random sample of the population? In a 2007 study by Carnahan and McFarland, they put the same experiment advertisement in the paper as the Stanford one, and then did personality tests on everybody who responded, and results showed that volunteers for the prison study compared to the control group scored significantly higher on aggressiveness, authoritarianism, Machiavellianism, narcissism, and social dominance. They scored significantly lower on empathy and altruism. And then obviously we have all of the Texier's work come out in 2018 and 2019, which is a fantastic read, by the way. I will link the paper below if you want to see somebody just kindly, calmly, and academically slap a man in the face for 20 pages. It's one of the best examples of it, and I love when academics do that. But at the end of the day, A study that supposedly showed that random people in the wrong place turn evil actually showed that not random people, when instructed to do specific things in a hyper-specific, unrealistic setting while being paid for it, are probably going to do the things they're told to do, but also not all of them, because many of them will still fight back if they believe that the thing that you're forcing them to do is morally wrong. Which, I don't know about you, but I like that outcome better, actually. Like, the 1960s and 70s view of, like, all humans are terrible and don't really have that much free will, and that's why the Holocaust happened, that was then supposedly backed up by all this research of the era, never really sat right with me whenever I would hear about it in my classes, because, like, I've worked with a lot of people, I've studied people my whole life, and I know that things are a lot more complicated than that, and people are a lot more feisty and nuanced and messy, and also inherently good, and the majority of people believe that they are doing the right thing, then just, like, everybody sucks, and it's the situation that makes them do bad things, because, like, why else would revolutions happen? Why would resistances happen? And much of the mass oppression that we see is not a result of humans being evil people, it's the result of learned hatred, or at least uncomfortability around people who are different. And those are things that we can put an effort to overcome and to learn from. Like, the majority of people who supposedly stood by and watched the Holocaust happen didn't actually know what was going on, or if they had any idea, they felt powerless to stop it, or they did small aspects of resistance while trying to keep themselves and their family alive. And this also isn't Holocaust specific, this generalizes out to all major oppressive regimes. I mean, like, if we want to reframe to what's going on in the United States right now in the same lens and see how we individually are involved or are not involved, it's different, obviously, but it's not that different. And also, for the record, if you're gonna do something illegal or controversial where people could get discovered and then put in jail for what they're doing, literally the first thing that you're gonna do is you're gonna create cells where nobody knows anything outside of their cell, and there's only one person connecting each one, but nobody actually knows who's in charge or what's going on or what the overall plan or purpose of the plan is. That's like the cardinal rule of the thing. So blaming a full population for a thing like that is very complicated and kind of silly in its own right, because that's just not how things are structured. But anyway, I think if I'm looking at all of this correctly, Zimbardo's overall goal was to try to prove that people are not always bad, but rather that there is evil inside of them that can quickly come out when put in the wrong situation, and it's not actually their fault when that happens, so therefore it's our responsibility as a society to create spaces where that doesn't happen, which kind of implies that people cannot be trusted and we need to baby everybody all the time, which can best be exemplified by him then using this research to defend one of the main abusers from the Abu Ghraib prison scandal, saying that it wasn't actually really his fault that he did that, and he was just caught up in the situation and he shouldn't face any repercussions for what he did, which, yikes. Like, I'm all for the idea that there are no bad people, only bad actions, but that doesn't mean that bad actions are therefore okay to do without any consequences at all whatsoever because, oh whoops, this situation made me do it. Like, that's just not how that works. But what's intriguing to me about experiments like this, if actually constructed like an experiment with actual real data, which isn't this one, so branching off at this point here, is not that people are capable of doing these things, but that people rarely willingly do harm. They instead commit harm while thinking they are doing an important act of service simply because of how it is framed to them. For an extreme example, mercy killings of disabled people are still very common and not usually charged as murder because people think that they're doing the right thing. And that doesn't mean that people are inherently bad, it's that people can justify anything to themselves if they try hard enough, especially if it's along some line of oppression. You can get caught up in a situation, you can think that you are helping somebody who's really struggling, but you can still cause harm and you still need to be held accountable for that. And I feel like these original studies were almost afraid of the concept of accountability. They were trying to explain that people cause mass harm, but they don't know any better, so actually it's a sign that humans are evil and we're all doomed and we need psychology as a field to come and fix that, rather than simply acknowledging that intention and impact are just two different concepts. Like, yes, there are situations that almost inherently, the majority of the time, lead to abuse. Absolute power without accountability is a major one. Our current prison industrial complex and the carceral aspects of mental health care are another, but these are nuanced things that need to be studied and understood and broken down outside of a weird laboratory setting, because you can't create real world social conditions in a lab setting, especially when you're fudging data, but you can't create real world social conditions in a lab setting. And you can't take the results from one experiment about one hyper-specific niche thing, because that's how science works, and then extrapolate it to make wide claims about a gazillion other unrelated things, especially when those things are incredibly broad and also incredibly culturally specific as well. I do think Zimbardo is onto something a teeny tiny bit here, like the issues of abuse and learned helplessness in prison are huge ones that clearly he cared a lot about, but he didn't care enough to actually properly structure an experiment or ever admit that he was wrong or do any research on actual prisons at all whatsoever, and also also he tried to use his research to get people to not face responsibility for their objectively harmful actions, which is both not cool and also makes me deeply skeptical of what the precise desire was for creating that body of research in the first place, you know? Like, false memory syndrome guy created false memory syndrome to try to get away with abusing his children and saying that they made it up because they had this disease that he was studying. And I just like, what was the goal here? What was the plan? Why are you so invested in the idea that people can get caught up in sadistic stuff but shouldn't face any responsibility for doing it? Like, sir? But one of the biggest things that I learned from pulling all this apart is how so many famous studies that I was told were abject truth in the field of psychology from day one of studying this stuff have been debunked, and how our structure of research and publishing is leaned towards rewarding false positives, and there is a massive reckoning in the field right now on what that means and how we can conduct better research that is replicable and applicable to actual situations, and how a relatively young field is going to grow in the near future, which is both terrifying and makes me want to set it all on fire and give up because nothing is real, but also very interesting to realize how recent the history actually is and wonder how far we're going to go in our lifetimes, you know? Like, that's really cool to me. But the goal of all this is to remind you how important it is to look into things that don't feel quite right to you, or that lean into a really sexy headline with not a lot of depth behind it. What is real science and what is pop science, and what is trying to sell you something specifically about humanity as a whole because it aligns with a current cultural interest. Like, who is benefiting from the story that is being told, and what kinds of things can we look for that are red flags in research, such as gross extrapolation or lack of control group or lack of replicability or a tiny participant pool, or how can we think more critically about things that we learn and how they may impact how we see the world and potentially might make us more afraid of other human beings, because fear and anger goes much farther than happiness and love. It's a really great marketing tool. But I'm otherwise going to leave this one here. I hope that you learned something today. If you want to learn more about things in science that you thought you knew about that you don't, I have a playlist linked above and also at the top of my description called Psst, Your Psych and Bio Prof Lied to You, which has more videos like these. Also, let me know if there's any other things like this that you want to learn more about. I think learning what went wrong in the past is a great way to do better in the future, so I always love researching this kind of stuff, even when it makes me very angry and also question everything about existence at all whatsoever. But that's healthy and good. We love doing that. But yeah, as always, thank you for listening. Thank you for learning. Remember, it's never too late to start over. Remember, critical thinking is really, really sexy. And I look forward to seeing you, my dear, in the next one.